Finally, I got to read the sequel to The Painted Man. Just to remind you how much I love this book, in my review of it, I gave it a 9 out of 10, and the only thing preventing it from being a perfect 10 out of 10 to me was the pacing. So to say I have high expectations for the sequel is no understatement. But before we get into the review, here's some background on the book. The Desert Spear was written by, is written by Brett and is the sequel to his, I think it's debut novel, The Painted Man. The Desert Spear was published in 2010 by Del Rey, and it got nominated for Best Fantasy Novel 2011, the David Gemmell Legend Award nominee for Best Fantasy Novel 2011 too, and it also got the Goodreads Choice Award for Fantasy in 2011. Guy with a sword. Well, not entirely, it's a guy with a spear, but my point still stands. I really don't like those type of covers. I know the cover is supposed to show Jadir and his warded spear. To me the cover is just boring. I don't know, maybe have him fight a demon instead of fighting us. Like, it looks like he's attacking us, and I don't like that. I think it's boring. And I think showing us Jadir like this really isn't selling the book itself, because at first I thought it was Ireland and the story would involve him more in Croatia, so really the book kinda missed me with the point there. Well, I guess that's how it is. Moving on to... So, where the first book followed Ireland and told his story on how he became the Painted Man or Warded Man, this book follows Jadir. He's claimed the title of Shah Damarka, which means the Deliverer. I'm not gonna go give a full summary of every part of the book, but I will discuss my favorite and least favorite parts of the sections in the book. This part follows Jadir as he grows up and how he turned into the Shah Damarka, while also has a small, very small subplot set in the later years where we learn how he takes control over the other forts like Fort Risen. To be fair, I think it was a great way to establish him as a character and to give us some exposition on his people, since we didn't get to learn too much about them when Ireland was visiting them in the first book. However, I do also think it creates, at least for me, feeling of discontinuity. And it makes a lot of the world building from book 1 feel irrelevant. In some ways, I think Brett should have made the background story of Jadir a separate novella and show us more on how he assembled an army and how he took on Fort Risen. I do have something that I want to discuss that I didn't know where to put, so I'm putting it here. It's the rape scene. Yeah. There's one and some references to higher ranking warriors raping the younger warriors. I don't know what to feel about them. I think I would have preferred it being something very much in the background. Also, since Jadir gets raped technically and it just has no effect on him. Now, before anyone goes and say he took his revenge on the guy Hasik, he was already planning to take revenge on Hasik for bullying him and the arm breaking. So it didn't add anything to the story other than just making Hasik like a rapist. And I mean, that's horrible, I'm not saying that, but it didn't change the story. And to be honest, I think Brett should just have stayed away from that subject. I think everybody should do that, especially since it didn't add anything to the story. With that out of the way, let's move on to a different subject, the setting and the people. Croatia and its people really just some Arabian people where the religion is Islam and they're on a jihad against the demons. God, this review is getting perfect for YouTube. Oh no. It's not particularly bad, but it's not a unique idea. When the first book, most of the forts had kind of generic fantasy setting. It wasn't the people or the culture, except for the warding aspect, that were in focus. But here they're almost as important as Jadir himself, and the warding part has actually taken like a backseat, and is barely even there. And I don't think that's what the book should have gone with, given that the people and the culture is so much in the center. It saddens me that then the culture is so boring and generic. It doesn't feel unique or anything. If you're gonna put your unique magic system in the background, you need your culture and your people to feel unique and different. And no. Talking about cultures, the discussion with Aban about how to create an army and have it march across the desert while keeping the city safe and under his control is great, and it shows that Brett is aware of the logistics of war and not just the quote-unquote fun of it in a fantasy world. I also think it greatly highlights a flaw of Jadir. He's eager and he's full of honor. He doesn't always think the situation through, but it also shows that Jadir isn't stupid. As soon as Aban points out the challenges, he realizing Aban only pointed them out because he also have the solutions. For coin, of course. Ending this section with Jadir getting the crown felt pretty good. I mean, it's where it should end. Because I got a feeling he still isn't sure that he is the one who should be wearing it, since Arlen was the one who actually found the cave and the spear. But it was a pretty cool moment, also seeing how far Aban has come as an advisor and how much Aban and Jadir's wife can manipulate him into taking on this role of Shah Damakar, and how much he kinda believes it but kinda doesn't. So what do I think? Well, I think the book has me split. It has a lot of great moments where Brett is showing that 9 out of 10, borderline 10 out of 10 writing and storytelling. The fact that the book needs to rebuild so much of its world is really dragging it down to me. I said in the beginning that the Krasians, this feels like a generic fantasy world, Persia-inspired thing, and I stand by that. They still feel that way to me, not that they aren't interesting, just that they don't feel unique. The magic and Brett's character moments are doing a lot of the carrying here. It isn't bad. Like I said, have the background of Jadir be a novella, and start the story later in his age. Then have the world building happen as he's planning to take over other places, and end the section with him taking Fort Risen. I think that would make the story better. But also allow for more of the world building from the first book to carry its weight. Then use the novella to world build more of the Krasian culture. That's just me. Anyways, the book is hovering around the 6 out of 10 right now. It isn't bad, but it isn't as good as the first one. But I mean, there's still 300 pages, so let's move on to... I have to confess something. I completely forgot about Lisha and Rocher. But as soon as the section started, I remembered the stories again, so that's a great thing. Starting the section with Rocher and Lisha instead of Arlen might seem like a weird move, but Arlen was already in the previous section. A little, not a lot. So it makes sense to introduce them back into the story at first opportunity. And also they having more centralized role in the city also allows for exposition to be dropped as they wander the city. Talking about the city, the changes made to the city after the last battle in book 1 is insane. Forming the city as a giant ward to protect the streets at night, the villagers all learning to fight, and they're now actively fighting the demons at night. It's such a great and such an intriguing way to show time has passed, but also such a natural continuation of the magic system. Of course they're going to study the wards and try to make new and better ones. And of course, after that fight, the villagers would want revenge on the demons. My only real gripe with this is in the first book, the skills of Lisha, Arlen, and Rocher pretty much separated, and it made them stand out. Rocher could control the demons with music, Lisha could heal and brew the potions and all that fancy chemistry stuff, and Arlen was the warding guy. I'm not saying they can't overlap each other and can learn from each other, but by making it so Lisha is the one who can pretty easily read and grasp new words just by looking at them, and not Arlen, seems like Brett is worried people might just see her as a damsel and not the awesome woman she is. I think it would be more fun if Lisha could use her skills to come up with new cool ways to use the wards, like the cloak she designed that makes the wearer invisible to the demons, and then Arlen having to work out the wards. Or maybe Lisha is so used to reading and writing that after seeing the words, she could easily copy them, but Arlen is the one who can come up with new ones, and then Lisha could use her knowledge of already existing words to make new cool products like the cloaks. I mean, can you hear? I think the cloaks are awesome. I think it's so cool. When working with the sequel, there's the main characters, and there's a potential huge problem, which is character growth. What do? Do you just have one of your main characters have an arc in the first book, and then the second main character have an arc in the second book, and so on and so forth? Or to have them all have an arc in the sequel, they then have another arc in some way again. I don't think there's a correct answer to what to do here. I think it has to be looked on a case-by-case situation. So why is this relevant? Well, first and foremost, this is a sequel, And second of all, in the first book, Roshan, Lisha, and Arlen all had some growth as characters, and all had their fair share of arcs. So what do Brett do in this book? He allows them to grow further. He does this by bringing them into situations where they're uncomfortable. This forces the characters to grow and adapt. We see this by having Roshan teach music and Lisha basically work as townspeaker. He brings them into situations where the skills and the growth they had in the first book is still going to be the basis, but it's now in a new, different way of doing it. So it puts them on thin ice after having just been, on safe ground. But it doesn't feel jarring, it doesn't feel forced, it's good. So who is the true deliverer? Before we talk about that, let's get it out of the way. Yes, this entire story is Jesus fighting demons. It wasn't super open in the first book, but this book is definitely just the story of Jesus realizing he is Jesus. You can see it as the first book being an allegory for the part where Jesus grew up, but instead of being a carpenter, he is now a warder. And now we have him as being the chosen one, and his so far only 2 disciples trying to convince him he is following in his every step. Going with this allegory, you can see Jadir as being Muhammad, and Brett saying they are both sons of God, but with different ideologies, which is quite a cool interpretation in my opinion. I don't know if Brett is religious, or if I'm putting way too much thought into this, but it's a cool way to see it. Now, the question then becomes, does it change my view of the book so far? Not really. I think the allegory is fine. It isn't the first time that Jesus' story has been reimagined into a fantasy world, and also seeing Jesus fighting demons are badass in my opinion and more fun. Going back to the who's the true deliverer, I think, to be honest, it's kind of like both of them. I think that's where Brett is both Muhammad and Jesus were the true sons of God, if you can call that, while in this case both Jadir and Arlen are both the deliverers of this world. My final thoughts on this section. The story got better. It has raised itself up to a strong 8 out of 10. I also think what the other sections was missing were more of the smaller character moments. If character had a moment, it was plot relevant, and it made it seem like the characters weren't living characters but puppets for Brett. I think it ended that way because he had to do so much world building and tell a story that probably should have been its own book. Nonetheless, the book gets better with time, and I'm excited for starting this section off with something I deliberately didn't talk about in the last section, the Renna sub-story. It's not that I don't like this subplot, I just feel very uncomfortable with the entire thing. But I suppose that is the purpose. I'm not gonna go too much into detail about it, but I do think we should talk about the handling of the villagers who are out for blood. The way Celia handles them and tries her best to make sure they don't just outright murder Renna because they think she killed her dad and a man she's in love with is brilliant. You can clearly tell Celia might not know what actually happened, but she's 100% sure that Renna didn't kill in cold blood but in self-defense, and her trying her best to make sure Renna gets a proper trial is amazingly written, but still very uncomfortable to read. The council meeting was both really interesting and really boring at once. It's kind of hard to describe, because it had the usual Brett writing of great small character things, but at the same time, it just felt so generic. However, the ending where Celia said if they have to follow the law, they must do it as written was chilling, since all of them just expected to, raise at the stake, have the demons kill her while they sleep. But nope, it said they had to watch, so she will ensure that. Alright, moving back to Arlen. He's visiting cops and seeing Elisa. Oh my god, that was so moving. And then visiting Mary and their fight. Oh, I was tearing up. I think Brett hit the nail on the coffin there with how the world had changed and how they never forgot about him, but they had to move on. The fact Elisa could recognize him after all this time without seeing his face was, it hit home, it hit hard. And the fact that Arlen became a person again after seeing his adopted family was so good. Because up until now, he's been the warded man, but not really a character. Well, not really a person, just a persona he puts on. And he still puts on that persona, but now he's a bit more himself, and I hope we see more of that. Skipping ahead, the meeting between Lisha and Jadir. Finally the two main stories almost meet up. I love the way Jadir shows great character and humanity when he forces his soldiers to fight alongside the people of Deliverer's Hollow. The base trait of at night all men are brothers, is a core principle of Jadir and the Krasian people, and we spent the first entire section of the book learning about it. So it's great to see that this stays true, even when they're not in their own country. Back to the meeting. I loved it. All other former meetings in the book were mediocre at best, but this was fun. The clashing of cultures and ending in war stories with laughs, like showing off, oh, I got this scar, but that was nothing compared to this scar, and oh, that was so fun. That's the way meetings between warriors in fantasy worlds tends to end, and I know it's generic, I know it's like so basic, but I love those. I think they're so fun. But let's look a bit deeper into the meaning of this book. We can clearly now see that Brett is trying to tell us a lot about racism, culture, and humanity. A great deal of time is spent showing racism and hatred between the two cultures, equally much both ways. Jadir even himself highlight how their cultures are seemingly meant to clash each other, as if telling Brett, hey, what you've created here are two polar opposites. We also see when they stop looking at the differences and relax, they really aren't so different after all. The meeting perfectly highlights that. Even the Krasian warriors, who are like super racist towards the people of Deliverer's Hollow, were having fun. To end this section talk, I think Brett wants us to realize that sometimes we might focus a bit too much on where someone grew up or their religion, instead of who they are as a character or person. I think an underlying meaning to this is we should try and look into what we have in common and not our differences. And I personally think that is noble and something we should try to do. The book is risen to an 8.5 out of 10, maybe even a 9 like the first. Okay, so I didn't talk a lot about how Arlen took Renna with him, kind of like an apprentice. I like the small arguments about whether or not Renna should become like Arlen. However, isn't it a bit weird how every girl in Arlen's life falls in love with him and never stop loving him? To me, it doesn't seem logical after all that time that Renna would still love him. It would make sense for her to cling on to the thought of loving him, to like an escapist thought. But in actuality, the love would probably be gone once they would meet up again. Talking of Arlen, the ending fight with the Mind Demon, both on the surface and in the core. Oh, that was exciting. It was fun. He's truly becoming more and more of a demon. Or maybe he's actually going in the opposite direction without realizing it. At first, I didn't really know what to make of the Mind Demons or Prince Demons or whatever they were called, which is why I haven't mentioned them at all. After the fight with them, I've grown to like them. The ideas of them make sense to have some kind of leaders, but at the same time it kind of clashes with the idea of the demons being more like a hive. But I do think this will be explored more in the next installment, so I'm not too worried. I just want to point out that I feel a little conflicted about whether or not this is a good thing, but we'll see. And finally, I want to talk about Rocher and Lisha's visit to Jadir's conquered city. The cultural clashes and the misunderstandings were just cringe and fun at best. Like, it was so cringe every time Aban made a mistake towards Lisha, or Jadir tried so hard to court her. Also, the Inavara and Lisha jealousy / rivalry was fun to follow. I think the most fun I had was when Aban was involved. I don't know, there's just something about the way he tries to get information on everyone and also not upsetting anyone that I just love. I think he's the funniest character. And I think it was best that Lisha and Jadir didn't end up marrying it. But at the same time, they ended up forming something like an alliance between their quote-unquote nations. So I think this is like the best outcome. I could actually have seen Brett going for a marriage between them. I don't know, I think it's just better doing this. However, I could see Deliverer's Hollow turn into something like a city-state within Jadir's realm, kind of like the Papal States and in Italy. The book has its flaws, especially the first section, which sadly is also the longest of them. Brett is still an amazing writer when it comes to small character moments, but struggles when making an impact where there are multiple characters involved. The cultural clashes that happened in the book and the characters doing their best to avoid it was super entertaining, just jarring enough that you could feel the characters when they made a mistake and tried to correct themselves. I think the book also suffers from the same mistakes as the previous one, which is the pacing. I think too much time was spent on the first section rebuilding his world just to tell Jadia's story, when it would have been an amazing novella book on its own. All in all, it's a solid 7 out of 10, but gosh darn it, give Jadir his own book.